My family stood in my aunt's living room 3 days after the funeral, dividing everything up like it was a yard sale. Nobody cried. Nobody lingered. They moved through her life with a legal pad and a purpose, and when everything had been claimed, someone looked at me and said the old house on Calloway Road could go to me. Nobody wanted it. Nobody had wanted it for years. I told myself I'd go take a look, figure out what needed to be done, and move on. I had no idea that inside those walls, my grandmother had been keeping a secret for 40 years. A secret that was never meant for me, but somehow had been waiting for me all along. The day my grandmother died, it rained from morning until well past dark. I remember sitting in my car outside the funeral home, watching the water run down the windshield in long, crooked lines. I didn't go inside right away. I just sat there, engine off, hands in my lap, thinking about how strange grief feels when it arrives mixed with guilt. Because the truth is, I hadn't seen her in almost 4 years. Life had gotten in the way life always seems to when we let it. And now she was gone, and I had run out of time to fix that. Her name was Dorothy. Most people called her Tot. She was 83 years old when she passed, and she died the same way she had lived for as long as I could remember, quietly, without asking anyone for anything, without making a fuss. The family gathering happened 3 days after the funeral, on a gray Tuesday afternoon at my Aunt Linda's house in Ohio. I drove 4 hours to get there. My husband offered to come with me, and I told him I'd be fine. I wasn't sure that was true, but I said it anyway. That's something I've always done, told people I was fine when I wasn't, smiled in rooms where I felt completely invisible. I suppose I learned that somewhere. I'm only now beginning to understand where. When I walked into Linda's house, the mood wasn't what I expected. There was no real sadness in the air. People were talking in normal voices, eating from a deli tray on the kitchen counter, moving through the house with purpose. It felt less like a family gathering and more like an estate sale that hadn't officially opened yet. My cousin Brett was already asking about the china cabinet in the dining room. My Aunt Linda had a legal pad on the kitchen table with a handwritten list of items. There was a quiet efficiency to all of it that made my chest feel tight in a way I couldn't explain. I poured myself a cup of coffee and stood near the window and watched. Nobody asked me what I wanted. I'm not saying that to sound bitter. I want to be honest with you about that. I was never the one in my family who pushed for things. I was the middle child in a family where the middle always meant invisible. My older sister was the responsible one. My younger brother was the funny one. I was just there, present, dependable, easy to overlook. My grandmother and I had something quiet between us, something that didn't require much talking. But I was never sure if she saw me the way I hoped she did. So I stood near the window. I drank my coffee. I watched my family divide her life into categories. It was my Aunt Linda who finally brought up the house. She set down her legal pad and said it the way you'd mention a broken appliance, matter of fact, slightly inconvenient, already half decided. The house on Calloway Road. The old one. Nobody had been living in it for almost 6 years. The roof needed work. There was some kind of moisture issue in the basement that nobody had dealt with. The yard had grown up wild. Linda said a developer had shown passing interest, but the offer was insultingly low and the timing had never been right. She looked around the room. Nobody spoke. Then she looked at me. I still don't fully understand why she looked at me. Maybe because I was standing apart from everyone else. Maybe because I hadn't claimed anything off her list. Maybe because in families like mine, the overlooked one always ends up with what nobody else will take. Whatever the reason, she looked at me and said, "I suppose it makes sense for it to go to you." And just like that, it was decided. My cousin Brett laughed, not cruelly, just casually, and said I was brave. My sister gave me a look across the room that I couldn't quite read. Aunt Linda made a note on her legal pad and moved on to the contents of the upstairs closets. I drove home 4 hours in the dark, and I didn't tell my husband what had happened until I was already in bed with the lights off. I want you to understand something before this story goes any further. I was not excited. I was not curious. I was not standing at the edge of some great adventure, full of hope and energy. I was a 51-year-old woman who was tired in ways that are hard to explain, tired from years of working, tired from raising children, tired from being the person in every room who holds things together quietly and gets thanked for it quietly and then gets forgotten quietly. I was the kind of tired that sleep doesn't fix. The house on Calloway Road was just one more thing that had landed in my lap because no one else wanted it. That's how I saw it. That's how I drove there 3 weeks later on a cold Saturday morning in November, coffee in the cup holder, radio off, telling myself I would just take a look, decide what needed to be done, and figure out the fastest responsible way to handle it. I pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine. The house sat there in the gray morning light, surrounded by overgrown grass and bare trees and the kind of silence that old houses carry like a second skin. The paint was peeling along the eaves. One shutter hung at an angle on the front window. The porch steps looked soft in the middle, like they'd been wet one too many times. It looked like a house that had been waiting. I sat in that driveway for a long time. Longer than made sense. My coffee went cold and I didn't notice. I kept looking at the front door, that same dark green door I remembered from childhood, and I felt something move through me that I didn't have a name for yet. I was not ready to go inside. Not yet. I just sat there in the quiet, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I let myself feel something without trying to fix it right away. The house waited. And somehow, without understanding why, I knew I was going to stay. I didn't go inside that first day. I drove home, made dinner, helped my husband with something in the garage, and didn't talk about the house at all. I told myself I was being practical, thinking it through, making a plan. But honestly, I was avoiding it. There's a difference between planning and avoiding, and I've spent enough years in my own company to know which one I was doing. I went back 6 days later. A Tuesday. I brought cleaning supplies, a box of garbage bags, a thermos of coffee, and absolutely no plan beyond walking through the front door and seeing what I was dealing with. I parked in the same spot in the driveway. I sat for a few minutes, the way I had the first time. Then I got out of the car before I could talk myself out of it again. The porch steps were softer than they looked. I tested each one carefully before putting my full weight down. The wooden railing wobbled when I touched it. I made a mental note and kept moving. The green front door had a skeleton key lock, and the key was on a small brass ring that Aunt Linda had handed me in a sandwich bag at the gathering, without ceremony, the way you hand someone a receipt they didn't ask for. The lock was stiff. It took both hands and a moment of patience. And then the door opened, and the smell of the house came out to meet me. There is a specific smell that old houses carry when they've been closed up for years. It isn't unpleasant, exactly. It's layered, dust and dry wood and something faintly sweet underneath, like old paper or dried flowers or the ghost of 100 meals cooked in the same kitchen. It's the smell of time that stopped moving. I stood in the doorway for a moment and just breathed it in, and without any warning or permission, I was 8 years old again. I stepped inside. The front hallway was narrow, with dark wood floors and a coat hook on the wall that still held one item, a faded canvas tote bag with a hardware store logo on it. Her handwriting was on a piece of masking tape stuck to the strap. Just the word library. She had written it in blue ballpoint pen in her careful, old-fashioned cursive. I stood there looking at that canvas bag for a long time. I didn't touch it. I wasn't ready to touch it. I moved slowly through the house. I want to describe it that way because that's exactly how it felt, slow, like moving through water, like the house itself was asking me not to rush. the living room was to the left of the hallway. The furniture was still there, her green sofa with the crocheted throw folded over the arm, the wooden side table with the ring stain she'd had for as long as I could remember, the lamp with the cream-colored shade that always sat slightly crooked no matter how many times someone straightened it. Dust had settled over everything like a thin gray blanket. The curtains were drawn. I crossed the room and opened them, and the morning light came in pale and quiet, and I stood in it for a moment and let it fall across my face. I thought about all the Sunday afternoons I had sat on that green sofa as a child. She would be in her chair near the window with her crossword puzzle, pencil in hand, occasionally asking me questions she already knew the answers to. She never made me feel rushed or unwanted. She never filled the silence with noise. I was the kind of child who needed quiet company more than conversation, and somehow she understood that without me ever saying so. Standing in that room, I missed her in a way that caught me completely off guard. I made my way to the kitchen next. The kitchen was at the back of the house, and it was the room that held the most of her. Her apron still hung on the hook beside the refrigerator, the yellow one with the small roosters printed along the hem. I touched it carefully, just the edge of it, and pulled my hand back. A coffee mug sat on the counter near the sink, clean, upside down on a dish towel. Like she'd washed it and set it there to dry and simply never came back to put it away. I found her grocery list tucked under a small ceramic rooster on the counter. Handwritten. Milk, bread, black-eyed peas, dish soap, batteries. Ordinary things. A whole ordinary week that never happened. I folded it carefully and put it in my jacket pocket without thinking about why. I stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the backyard. The garden she used to keep along the fence had gone completely wild. The rose bushes had grown tall and tangled and bare in the November cold. But I could see the shape of what it had been, the care and the intention still visible underneath the wildness. That felt like something. I wasn't sure what yet. I spent the better part of that day moving through the rooms slowly. The small bathroom with the pink tile she'd never replaced. The back bedroom where I used to sleep on visits as a child, the same quilt still folded at the foot of the bed. The narrow window that looked out over the side yard where an oak tree had dropped so many leaves they'd drifted up against the foundation like a tide. Every room held something small that undid me a little. A pair of reading glasses folded on the nightstand. A birthday card tucked into the frame of the bathroom mirror, the kind you buy at the drugstore, signed in a child's handwriting, mine, I realized, from decades ago. A small calendar on the kitchen wall still turned to the month she died, a doctor's appointment circled in red pen that she never made it to. I didn't cry right away. I moved through the rooms and I looked at things and I held myself together with both hands the way you do when you're alone and there's no one to fall apart in front of. The crying came later, that evening, sitting on the back porch steps as the sun went down cold and orange behind the tree line. My phone rang twice and I didn't answer it. I just sat there and let everything come up that had been waiting to come up since the day she died. It was when I came back inside, wiping my face with my sleeve and reaching for my thermos, that I heard it. I almost missed it. I was tired, and the light inside had gone dim, and I was already thinking about the drive home. But I knocked my knuckle against the wall in the back hallway as I passed, just accidentally, just grazing it, and the sound that came back stopped me completely. Not solid. Not the flat sound of plaster over brick or wood framing. Hollow. Distinctly, deliberately hollow. I stood very still and knocked again, more carefully this time. I pressed my palm flat against the wall and felt nothing unusual, just smooth old plaster, cool under my hand. But the sound was wrong. Empty in a way that didn't match the rest of the house. I told myself it was nothing. Old houses have quirks. Walls settle. Things shift over decades in ways that don't mean anything. I picked up my thermos, turned off the kitchen light, and walked out to my car. But I thought about that wall the entire drive home. And I thought about it all the next day. And the day after that. She appeared on a Thursday morning, the way older neighbors do, without announcement, without hurry, carrying something in her hands as a reason for the visit. I had been at the house for about 2 hours by then, working through the kitchen cabinets with a box of garbage bags and a notepad, cataloging what was there and what needed to go. I heard footsteps on the porch before the knock came, a slow, careful steps, the kind that belong to someone who has learned not to rush. I opened the front door and found a woman standing there, somewhere in her late 70s, holding a foil-covered plate with both hands. She told me her name was Evelyn. She had lived in the yellow house directly across the street for 31 years. She said she had watched someone moving around inside and hoped she wasn't intruding. Her eyes were calm and dark, and they moved across my face with the quiet attention of someone who notices things and always has. I told her she wasn't intruding at all. I held the door open and she came inside. We sat at the kitchen table with coffee I made from the small jar of instant I had brought from home. Evelyn set the foil plate down between us as lemon bars, she said, made that morning. She folded her hands around her mug and looked around the kitchen slowly, the way people do when they are seeing a place layered against their memories of it. She didn't speak right away. I had learned by then not to fill silences, so I waited. She said, "Dot was a good woman." She said it simply, without decoration, the way people state things they have believed for a long time without needing to prove them. I nodded and told her I knew that. Then I told her I was beginning to realize how much about my grandmother I hadn't known at all. Evelyn looked at me over her mug. Something shifted slightly in her expression, not alarm, but a kind of careful attention, like someone deciding how far down a road they are willing to walk. She said, "No. I suppose most people didn't." We talked for nearly 2 hours that morning. Evelyn had moved across the street in 1993, she told me, when her own husband retired and they came back to Ohio to be near their children. By then, my grandmother had already been in that house for nearly 20 years. Evelyn described her as a woman who was unfailingly kind but almost impossible to truly know. She said my grandmother would bring soup when someone on the street was sick, would wave every single morning from the porch without fail, would remember birthdays and anniversaries and ask after people's grandchildren by name. But she never talked about herself. Not really. Evelyn said she had tried, over the years, in the gentle ways that neighbors try. She had asked about family, about the past, about where my grandmother had lived before Ohio. And she said my grandmother had a way of receiving those questions graciously and then redirecting the conversation so smoothly that you didn't notice it had happened until later, when you were back across the street in your own kitchen, realizing you still didn't know anything more than you had before. I recognized that. I recognized it deeply and immediately, and something in my chest tightened hearing it described by someone else. It was about halfway through our second cup of coffee that Evelyn said something that stayed with me. She said she had noticed, sometime in the mid-90s, that my grandmother seemed to carry a grief that had no visible source. Not the grief of someone who had recently lost something. The older kind. The kind that has been lived with so long it becomes part of a person's posture, part of the way they look out windows, part of the quality of their silences. She said, "Something happened to your grandmother before she came here. Something she decided nobody was going to know about." She didn't say it with drama. She said it the way you state the weather, observed, factual, carrying no judgment. I asked her if she had any idea what it might have been. She was quiet for a moment. She looked down at her coffee and then back up at me, and I could see her weighing something, not whether it was true, but whether it was hers to say. She told me that once, only once, in the early 2000s, she had come across the street to return a casserole dish and found my grandmother sitting on the back porch steps. Alone. In the cold. Holding a photograph. She said my grandmother heard her come around the corner and put the photograph away quickly, not guiltily, but with the practiced speed of someone who had been protecting something private for a very long time. She said she had never asked about it. She wished now that she had. After Evelyn left, I stood in the kitchen for a long time without moving. I thought about what she had described, that quality of grief, that gentle but absolute privacy, and I turned it over against everything I remembered about my grandmother. Every quiet afternoon on that green sofa. Every question she deflected with warmth. Every time I had been in her presence and felt both completely comfortable and somehow unable to get close. I had always assumed her distance was simply her nature. Her generation. The way certain women of a certain era were raised to keep their inner lives to themselves, to be present and useful and self-contained. I had never once considered that the distance might be the shape of something specific. Something that had a story behind it. I went back to work after Evelyn left. I moved through the bedroom, opened the closet, began sorting through the things on the upper shelf, shoeboxes, folded linens, a broken clock radio still in its original box. I worked carefully and methodically, the way I always work when my mind is moving fast underneath. It was in the nightstand drawer that I found the Bible. It was small and black, with a cracked spine and a ribbon marker faded to no particular color. Her name was written inside the front cover in the same careful cursive I had seen on the canvas tote bag in the hallway. I turned the pages slowly, not reading, just looking, and then something slipped out from near the back and fell into my lap. A photograph. Black and white, slightly creased along one corner. 2 young women standing close together somewhere outdoors. Trees behind them, sunlight on their faces, both of them squinting slightly and smiling. One of them was my grandmother, young, 20-something, a version of her face I had only ever seen in 1 or 2 other pictures. I recognized her immediately. The other woman I had never seen before in my life. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in my grandmother's handwriting, in blue ballpoint pen, a name I didn't recognize, and a single date. 1969. I set the photograph down on the nightstand very carefully, as if it might break. I sat on the edge of the bed in the quiet of that room, in the pale afternoon light coming through the curtain, and I looked at the ceiling for a long moment. Something had happened in 1969. Something my grandmother had carried alone for the rest of her life, through every kind wave and warm soup and morning wave from the porch, through every conversation gracefully redirected, through every photograph quickly hidden on a cold back porch. I picked up the photograph again and looked at the 2 young women smiling in the sunlight. I wanted to know who she was. I needed to know what happened. I didn't sleep well that night. I lay in my own bed at home, in the dark, with my husband breathing slowly beside me, and I stared at the ceiling and thought about a hollow wall and a photograph from 1969 and a woman I had never seen before in my life. Those 3 things kept arranging and rearranging themselves in my mind like pieces of something I didn't yet have the frame for. I got up twice, once for water, once for no reason at all, and both times I stood in the kitchen in the dark and thought about that back hallway. There is a particular kind of curiosity that doesn't feel like excitement. It feels more like pressure. Like something pressing quietly but persistently against the inside of your chest, asking to be let out or let in, you're not entirely sure which. That's what I felt standing in my kitchen at 2 in the morning. Not thrill. Just pressure. Just the quiet, insistent feeling that something was waiting. I went back to the house the following Saturday. I told myself I was going to focus on the bedroom closet and the remaining boxes on the upper shelf. I brought my notepad and my coffee and my garbage bags and I walked in through the green front door with every intention of being practical and methodical and unbothered. I hung my coat on the hook in the hallway beside her canvas tote bag. I set my thermos on the kitchen counter. I walked toward the bedroom. And then I stopped in the back hallway. I stood there and looked at the wall. In the daylight it looked completely ordinary, smooth old plaster, painted over so many times the surface had a slightly soft, layered quality. The baseboard along the bottom was the same dark wood as the rest of the house. There was nothing unusual about it visually. Nothing that would make you stop or wonder. Except I knew what it sounded like. I raised my knuckle and knocked, once, slowly, in the middle of the wall. That same sound came back. Hollow. Unmistakably empty behind it. I knocked at the left edge, near the corner. Solid. I knocked at the right edge. Solid. I moved my hand across the surface methodically, knocking every few inches, mapping the hollow space by sound the way you might find a stud, except in reverse, looking for the absence rather than the presence. The hollow section was roughly 4 feet wide and ran from about knee height to somewhere above my head. Deliberate in its dimensions. Too consistent to be accidental. I stood back and looked at it for a long time. That afternoon I drove to the county records office. I want to tell you this part carefully because it matters more than it might seem. I'm not someone who does dramatic things impulsively. I'm not someone who tears into walls on instinct. I needed to understand what I was looking at before I did anything about it. I needed to know if the wall was supposed to be there. The clerk at the records office was patient with me. She pulled the property file for the house on Calloway Road and walked me through the original building plans from when the house was constructed in 1951. The back hallway was not in those plans. It appeared in a permit filing from 1974, an interior modification, listed simply as a hallway addition connecting the kitchen to the back bedroom. The permit was filed and approved. The work was listed as complete. My grandmother had moved into that house in 1972. She had that wall built 2 years after she arrived. I sat in the parking lot of the records office for a while after that. The math of it kept moving through my mind, 1969 in the photograph, 1972 when she moved in, 1974 when she built the wall. 3 years. 3 years between whatever happened and the moment she sealed something inside a wall in the back hallway of a house in Ohio. I drove back to Calloway Road. I called a handyman named Dale that my husband had used a few times for projects around our house. He came the next morning, a quiet, unhurried man in his 60s with a gray work shirt and a level on his belt. I showed him the wall and asked him to tell me what he thought. He knocked on it the same way I had, moved his hand across the surface, crouched down and looked along the baseboard. He stood up and put his hands in his pockets. He said, "That's been sealed up on purpose." No question. He told me it wasn't load-bearing. Wasn't structural in any way that mattered to the integrity of the house. He said whoever built it had done a clean job, good plaster work, properly finished. He said opening it wouldn't be complicated. An hour, maybe less. I thanked him and told him I'd be in touch. He gave me a look on his way out, not intrusive, just the look of a man who has worked in enough old houses to know that walls sometimes hold more than insulation. He didn't say anything else. He just nodded and walked back to his truck. I stood alone in the back hallway after he left. I made the decision on a Wednesday. Not dramatically. Not with a racing heart or trembling hands. I simply woke up that morning and understood that I was going to open the wall, and that I had probably known that since the moment I first knocked my knuckle against it by accident 2 weeks before. Some decisions don't arrive as decisions. They arrive as recognitions, the moment you admit to yourself what you already knew you were going to do. I drove to the hardware store and bought a utility knife, a small pry bar, and a dust mask. The man at the checkout counter asked if I was doing some remodeling. I told him something like that. I drove to the house. I changed into old clothes I had brought in a bag. I stood in the back hallway one more time and looked at that wall in the quiet morning light. Then I started. I want to describe this part slowly because it deserves to be told slowly. I scored the plaster carefully with the utility knife, working along the edges of the hollow section I had mapped by sound. The old plaster crumbled at the score lines cleanly, the way it does when it's been undisturbed for a very long time. I worked without hurrying. I was not excited. I was not frightened. I was something else entirely, a feeling I still don't have a perfect word for, somewhere between reverence and resolve. The first section of plaster came away in a single piece. Behind it was a layer of drywall, newer than the plaster, added over the original surface. I worked the pry bar along the edge gently, carefully, the way you handle something that might matter. The drywall came loose in sections. Dust filtered down through the morning light. The house was completely silent around me. And then the space opened up. It was narrow, perhaps 18 inches deep, running the full 4-foot width I had measured. The air that came out was dry and still, the way sealed spaces hold their air for decades without movement. I stood very still and let my eyes adjust to the dim interior. On the floor of the space, centered carefully, as though placed with intention, sat a wooden box, the size of a shoebox, maybe slightly larger, made of dark wood with a simple latch. Beside it, tied with a length of faded kitchen string, was a bundle of envelopes. Beside that, a small leather journal, dark brown, with a worn brass clasp. And beneath everything, laid flat against the floor like it had been placed there last and most deliberately, one more photograph. I did not reach in immediately. I stood in the hallway with plaster dust on my sleeves and my heart beating in a way I felt in my throat, and I looked at those objects in that dry, still space, and I understood with complete certainty that I was the first person to see them in 40 years. My grandmother had put them there. She had sealed them inside this wall and painted over them and lived her entire remaining life in this house knowing they were there, 3 feet from where she walked every single day between the kitchen and the bedroom. I sat down on the hallway floor. Right there in the dust and the plaster debris. I sat down because my legs asked me to. I reached in and lifted the journal out first. Small and dry and lighter than I expected. I turned it over in my hands once. Then I opened the cover. The first line of her handwriting stopped my breath completely. If anyone finds this, I am already gone and finally at peace. I sat on that hallway floor for a long time before I read another word. The journal was in my hands and the first line was already inside me, settling into my chest like something heavy and warm and irreversible. If anyone finds this, I am already gone and finally at peace. I read it 3 more times. Not because I hadn't understood it, but because I needed to feel the full weight of what she had written before I moved any further into her words. She had written that sentence knowing it would only ever be read after she was gone. She had written it as a door she was opening from the other side of her own life, for someone she would never meet. I set the journal carefully on my knee and looked down the hallway toward the kitchen window. Late morning light was coming through at a low angle, pale and thin the way November light always is in Ohio. The house was completely still. No traffic outside, no wind, no sound of anything at all. Just me and the dust settling slowly back down through the light and the quiet that old houses hold so completely it almost has a texture. I thought about my grandmother walking this hallway every single day for 30 years. Morning and night. Kitchen to bedroom, bedroom to kitchen. Passing this wall without pausing, without looking, without allowing herself to stop and feel whatever was sealed inside it. I thought about what kind of discipline that requires. What kind of grief trains itself into silence so complete that nobody standing beside you for 30 years ever sees it moving underneath. I opened the journal to the second page and I began to read. Her handwriting was careful and unhurried throughout, the same cursive I had seen on grocery lists and canvas tote bags and birthday cards. But the words were nothing like grocery lists. They were the words of a woman who had kept herself locked in a very small room for a very long time and was finally, in the privacy of these pages, allowing herself to take up space. She began at the beginning. Not 1969, earlier than that. She wrote about growing up in rural Kentucky in the 1940s and 1950s, the third of 6 children in a household where money was always short and expectations for daughters were shorter still. She wrote about being bright in school and having a teacher who noticed and said so, and about how that small recognition had felt like a hand reaching down to pull her up from somewhere. She wrote about leaving home at 19 for Cincinnati, finding work in an office, feeling for the first time like her life had room in it to breathe. She wrote about meeting a man. Falling in love the way young women fall in love when they are 19 and newly free and the world feels large and full of possibility. She wrote about it without bitterness. I want you to understand that. She wrote about it the way you describe weather. It came, it was real, it moved through and left things changed. And then she wrote about 1969. I will tell you what she wrote the same way she wrote it, plainly, without drama, because that is the only way it deserves to be told. In the spring of 1969, my grandmother was 26 years old and she was pregnant. She was not married. The man involved was not available to her in any permanent way, and I will leave it at that because she left it at that, and I will respect the boundaries she drew even in her own private pages. She wrote that she had wanted to keep the child. She had wanted it with everything she had. She had been prepared to find a way, the way women find ways when they decide something matters enough. But her family did not agree. She wrote about the pressure that came, quiet at first, then less quiet, then arriving in the form of her own mother sitting across a kitchen table telling her plainly what would happen to her life, her reputation, her future, if she continued. She wrote about the year 1969 and what it meant to be an unmarried pregnant woman from a Kentucky family with no money and no protection and nowhere to stand that felt solid. She wrote about it without self-pity, and that absence of self-pity was the most heartbreaking thing about those pages. She gave the baby up in September of 1969. A girl. She wrote that she had held her for 45 minutes before they took her. She wrote those 45 minutes in more detail than anything else in the journal, the weight, the warmth, the specific sound of that first cry, the way the light was coming through the hospital window that afternoon. She had spent 40 years remembering 45 minutes. She had kept those 45 minutes more carefully than anything else in her entire life. I stopped reading when I reached that part. I set the journal face down on my knee and I pressed both hands over my eyes and I breathed, slowly, deliberately, the way you breathe when something has moved through you that you need a moment to absorb before you can continue. The woman in the photograph was named Ruth. I found her name in the letters, the bundle tied with kitchen string, which I opened carefully after I finished the journal. Ruth had been my grandmother's closest friend in Cincinnati throughout the 1960s. She had been present through everything, the relationship, the pregnancy, the terrible months of family pressure, the September morning at the hospital. She had sat in a waiting room for those 45 minutes. She had driven my grandmother home afterward. The letters were from Ruth, written across a span of about 4 years following 1969. They were full of the kind of love that exists between women who have stood beside each other through the unsurvivable and survived it anyway. Ruth wrote with warmth and humor and a directness that made me feel I knew her immediately. She asked after my grandmother constantly, worried about her openly, pushed her gently toward living. The last letter was dated 1973. After that, nothing. I don't know what happened to Ruth. Whether she moved, whether they lost touch the way people did before the internet made distance smaller, whether something else came between them. My grandmother never wrote about it in the journal. The absence of Ruth after 1973 sat in those pages like a missing step. You feel it when you reach for it and it isn't there. My grandmother moved to Ohio in 1972. She built the wall in 1974. I have thought about that sequence many times since. Moving first, then sealing things away. As though she needed to establish the new life before she could allow herself to close the door on everything that had preceded it. As though she was trying to be fair to herself, giving herself the chance to simply live, and then carefully, deliberately, putting the grief somewhere it wouldn't follow her through every room. Except she built it 3 feet from where she walked every day. That tells you something. That tells you she never actually wanted it to be gone. She just needed it to be contained. The last thing I found in the wooden box was an envelope, separate from Ruth's letters, unsealed. Inside was a single folded page. Different paper from the journal, lighter, almost fragile, like she had chosen it carefully. The handwriting was the same careful cursive but slightly looser, slightly older. Written later in her life, I guessed, by the way the letters leaned. It was addressed to no one by name. It began simply. I have thought about you every single day. I want you to know that first, before anything else. It went on for 1 full page. I will not tell you everything it said because some of it belongs only to the person it was written for. But I will tell you that it was written by a woman who had made peace with a choice that was never truly her choice, and who had loved someone across 40 years of silence with a completeness that made my chest ache to read. At the bottom of the page, in the final lines, she had written a name. A full name, first, middle, last, and a birth date. September 1969. I folded the letter back along its original creases and held it in both hands and sat very still in the dusty hallway light. Somewhere in this country, there was a woman in her mid-50s who had spent her entire life not knowing that a letter existed with her name on it. Part 6, What She Did Next. I drove home that evening with the wooden box on the passenger seat beside me. I hadn't planned to take it. I had stood in the hallway for a long time, looking at everything spread out on the floor around me, the journal, the letters, the photographs, the folded letter with its careful name and date, and I had understood that I couldn't leave any of it there. Not because I was afraid someone else would find it. Nobody had found it in 40 years. It wasn't going anywhere. I took it because leaving it felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate, the way certain things feel wrong before you have the language to explain why. I drove the whole way home with one hand resting on the lid of that box. My husband was in the kitchen when I got home, making dinner, the television on low in the background the way it always is on weekday evenings. He looked up when I came in and registered something in my face immediately. He has always been good at that, better than I give him credit for. He turned the stove down and leaned against the counter and waited. I set the box on the kitchen table and sat down and told him everything. He listened the way he listens when something matters, completely still, not interrupting, not rushing toward solutions or opinions. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he pulled out the chair across from me and sat down and looked at the box between us. He said, "What do you want to do? Not what should you do. Not what are you going to do. What do you want to do?" I have been married to this man for 26 years, and that single question, asked in that particular way, is one of the reasons I have stayed. I told him honestly that I didn't know yet. I didn't open the box again for 4 days. It sat on the corner of our kitchen table and I moved around it the way you move around something that requires more from you than you're currently ready to give. I cooked around it. I had coffee beside it in the mornings. My husband didn't ask about it again, which was its own kind of gift. Our daughter called on the second day. She's 24 and lives in Columbus, and I told her I had found something at the house that I needed to think through. She asked if I was okay. I told her I was okay, but that okay wasn't really the right word for what I was feeling. She drove up on the 3rd day without being asked. She sat across from me at the same kitchen table and I told her the story from the beginning, the same way I had told her father. She is a quieter version of me, same tendency to listen more than speak, same way of sitting with difficult things before reacting. She read the journal entries I showed her slowly and carefully. She held the photograph of the 2 young women in the sunlight for a long time without speaking. Then she looked up at me and said, "She never told anyone. Not one person in the whole family knew." It wasn't a question. It was a recognition, the same one I had been sitting with for 4 days. An entire life lived alongside a grief that nobody around her ever knew existed. Every family dinner, every holiday, every ordinary Tuesday. The soup she brought to sick neighbors, the crossword puzzles, the morning waves from the porch. All of it happening on the surface of something enormous and completely invisible. My daughter set the photograph down carefully and said, "We have to try to find her." I had already known that. I had known it since the moment I read the name at the bottom of that letter. But hearing my daughter say it out loud moved it from a feeling into a decision, and that difference mattered more than I expected. I want to be honest about the doubt that came alongside the decision, because it was real and it deserves to be acknowledged. I lay awake for several nights turning the same questions over and over. Who was I to insert myself into someone else's story? This woman, wherever she was, whoever she had become, had built an entire life without knowing any of this. She had a history, an identity, a complete sense of herself that had nothing to do with a sealed wall in Ohio or a journal or a letter with her name on it. What right did I have to arrive at the edge of that life and knock on the door? And yet, she had a letter written for her by a woman who had thought about her every single day for 40 years. A woman who had loved her across 4 decades of silence without ever being able to say so. That letter was sitting in a wooden box on my kitchen table, and the woman it was written for was almost certainly still alive, and she had almost certainly spent her whole life carrying questions that this letter could answer. The doubt didn't go away. But it got quieter. I contacted an ancestry search service on a Thursday morning in December. I had done enough research on my own first, careful, methodical searching through the kind of public records that are available to anyone with patience and an internet connection. The name and birth date from the letter gave me a starting point. Ohio adoption records from 1969 were sealed by law, which I had expected. But I knew the birth date, and I knew the birth state, and I knew enough surrounding details from the journal to narrow things considerably. The Ancestry Service was professional and careful. The woman I spoke with had a measured, unhurried manner that I was grateful for. She explained the process, the timeline, the limitations. She explained that they would search within their established channels and that if a match was found, contact would be initiated carefully, with the other party's full knowledge and consent. Nobody would be surprised. Nobody would be ambushed. The process existed specifically to protect both sides of the search. I gave her the information from the letter and she told me to expect a timeline of several weeks, possibly longer. I thanked her and sat for a while after the call ended. December became January. The house on Calloway Road sat empty through the coldest part of winter, and I visited it twice during those weeks, not to work, not to sort or clean or plan. Just to be there. I would make coffee and sit in the kitchen or on the back porch steps bundled in my coat and simply exist in the space that had held her for so long. I was beginning to understand the house differently by then. Not as a property with a moisture problem in the basement and a soft spot in the porch steps. As a place where a woman had chosen to live with something enormous and had managed, every single day, to also just be a person. A neighbor. A grandmother. Someone who remembered birthdays and brought soup and waved every morning from the porch without fail. I stopped thinking about selling it sometime in January. I didn't make an announcement about it. I didn't discuss it formally with anyone. I just noticed one morning that the thought of selling no longer entered my mind, and that its absence felt like a quiet resolution. My daughter called every week during those weeks. Always with the same first question, had I heard anything yet? Always with the same patience when the answer was no. She had become as invested in this as I was, maybe more, in the way that younger people sometimes connect with injustices from the past with a directness that those of us who are older have learned to muffle in ourselves. The call from the Ancestry Service came on a Tuesday afternoon in late January. I was in the grocery store when my phone rang, standing in the cereal aisle of all places, with a basket over my arm and absolutely no preparation for what was about to happen. I saw the number and walked immediately to a quiet corner near the back of the store and answered. The woman's voice was calm and warm. She told me they had found a strong match. She told me the individual had been contacted through their established process, had been given basic information, and had agreed, carefully, thoughtfully, after taking several days to consider, to accept further contact. I stood in the back corner of that grocery store and pressed my free hand flat against the wall beside me. She told me the woman's name, her full name, the name she had lived her whole life under, and she told me she was 54 years old and she lived in Tennessee. She had been looking. Not recently, years ago she had searched and hit the sealed wall of Ohio adoption records from 1969 and stopped, the way people stop when the door won't open and there's no visible handle. She had stopped searching, but she had never stopped wondering. The Ancestry Service gave her my contact information with my permission. They told me to expect a call, possibly within a few days, possibly longer. They said to be patient. They said beginnings like this one require a great deal of gentleness on both sides. I drove home from the grocery store without the groceries. My husband was in the driveway when I pulled in, getting something from his truck. He looked at my face and closed the truck door and walked toward me, and I stood beside my car in the cold January air and told him, and somewhere in the middle of telling him my voice gave out completely. He put his arms around me in the driveway and I stood there and cried in a way I hadn't cried since I was a child, not from sadness, not exactly, but from the specific overwhelming feeling of something lost for a very long time beginning, improbably and gently, to find its way home. She called on a Thursday evening, 9 days after the Ancestry Service told me to expect her. I had stopped anticipating it by then, or rather, I had learned to hold the anticipation loosely, the way you hold something fragile that you cannot afford to grip too tightly. I had gone back to ordinary life in the way you do when extraordinary things are in motion and there is nothing left to do but wait. I was folding laundry on the bed when my phone lit up with a Tennessee area code I didn't recognize, and I sat down on the edge of the mattress and answered before the second ring finished. There was a pause on the other end. Just a breath. Maybe two. And then a voice, the warm, careful, slightly unsteady in the way voices are when the person speaking has been rehearsing something for days and finds, in the actual moment, that none of the rehearsal prepared them adequately. She said, "I think you might have known my mother." I had promised myself I would be calm. I had told my husband that morning that I was going to be steady and clear and give her whatever she needed without falling apart. I managed approximately 4 seconds of that before my eyes filled completely. I told her my grandmother's name. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes." Just that one word. But the way she said it, the weight and the relief and the 40 years of wondering compressed into that single syllable, I will carry that sound for the rest of my life. We talked for 2 hours that first night. I want to be careful about how much I share of her story, because it belongs to her far more than it belongs to me. What I will tell you is what she chose to share freely, the things she said without hesitation, the parts of her life she offered across that phone call with the openness of someone who has waited a long time to say them out loud to the right person. She had grown up in a good family in Tennessee. Loved, wanted, raised with care. She told me that clearly and without qualification. She wanted me to understand that her life had been a real life, a full life, not a sad one. She had a husband and 2 grown children and a job she found meaningful and friends she had known for decades. She had built something solid and true. But she had always known she was adopted. And she had always carried, underneath everything solid and true, a quiet and persistent wondering. Not about who she was, she knew who she was. About where she had come from. About the specific story of how she had arrived in the world and what had surrounded that arrival and whether anyone on the other side of it had ever thought about her. She said, "I just wanted to know if I had been wondered about." I told her. I told her about the journal and the 45 minutes and the way my grandmother had written about that September afternoon in more detail than anything else in her entire life. I told her about the letter, that there was a letter, written for her, waiting for her. I heard her breath change on the other end of the line. Not crying, exactly. Something quieter than crying and deeper. She asked if she could come to Ohio. We agreed on a Saturday in March, 6 weeks away. Those 6 weeks moved differently than regular time. Not slowly, not quickly, just with a different quality, a heightened clarity, the way time moves when you know something significant is approaching and you find yourself paying attention to ordinary things with unusual care. I noticed the light more. I had longer conversations with my husband over dinner. I called my daughter more often than usual and we talked about things that mattered rather than the surface things we sometimes default to when life gets busy. I went to the house on Calloway Road 3 times during those 6 weeks to prepare it. Not to renovate or decorate or make it into something it wasn't. I cleaned it thoroughly and carefully, room by room, the same slow way I had first moved through it back in November. I repaired the porch steps so they were safe to walk on. I had the heat serviced so the house would be warm. I washed the curtains and rehung them. I left the furniture exactly as it was, the green sofa, the crooked lamp, the yellow apron on its hook beside the refrigerator. I wanted her to walk into the house as close to the way it had been as possible. I wanted her to be able to stand in the rooms where her mother had lived and feel the actual texture of that life, not a cleaned-up version of it. She deserved the real thing. She had waited long enough for the real thing. She arrived on a bright cold Saturday morning in early March. I was on the porch when her car turned onto Calloway Road, a sensible silver sedan with Tennessee plates, moving slowly the way people drive when they are looking at addresses. I stood at the top of the porch steps and watched her park and sit for a moment in her car, the same way I had sat in this very driveway back in November, unable to go in quite yet. Then her door opened and she got out. She was tall, with dark hair going silver at the temples, and she was dressed simply in a blue coat and dark pants, and she stood beside her car and looked at the house for a long moment before she looked at me. When she did look at me, her face was open and careful and full of something I recognized immediately because I had been carrying a version of it myself since the day I first opened that green front door. We walked toward each other and shook hands and then, without planning to, held on for a moment longer than a handshake requires. I said, "Thank you for coming." She looked past me at the house and said, "Thank you for finding it." I let her lead the way through the rooms. That felt important to me, that she should move through her mother's house at her own pace, in her own direction, stopping where she needed to stop, spending as long as she needed in whatever doorway or corner or patch of light called her. I walked behind her quietly, available but not intrusive, the way you accompany someone through something that is fundamentally theirs to experience. She stopped longest in the kitchen. She stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the wild rose bushes along the back fence for a very long time. She touched the yellow apron on its hook gently, with 2 fingers, the same way I had touched it months before. She picked up the small ceramic rooster from the counter and turned it over in her hands and set it back down in exactly the same spot. She didn't explain any of it and I didn't ask her to. In the living room she sat on the green sofa and looked around the room slowly. I sat in the chair by the window, her mother's chair, and we were quiet together for a while. The crooked lamp threw its familiar pale light. Outside, a car passed on the street and then it was quiet again. She said, "She lived here a long time." I told her 30 years. She nodded slowly and looked at the window and I watched something move through her face that I don't have the right words for, not sadness exactly, not happiness exactly. The specific feeling of receiving something you needed long after the moment when you needed it most has passed. Bittersweet is too small a word for it. It was something larger and more complicated and more human than that. I gave her the letter last. We were sitting at the kitchen table with coffee by then, the afternoon light coming through the clean curtains at a long low angle. I had brought the wooden box and I set it on the table between us the same way I had set it on my own kitchen table months before. I opened it and lifted the folded page from the envelope and held it out to her. She took it with both hands. She read it slowly. I looked out the kitchen window at the rose bushes and gave her the privacy of those minutes. When I looked back, she had set the letter flat on the table in front of her and was pressing both palms down on it gently, as though she needed to feel it was real, as though something that had traveled 40 years through a sealed wall deserved to be met with the full weight of both hands. She didn't say anything for a while. I didn't say anything either. Then she looked up at me and said she knew my name. I told her yes. Her mother had written her name at the bottom of that letter. Had carried it, along with everything else, through 30 years of mornings and crossword puzzles and soup brought to sick neighbors and waves from this very porch. Had kept it sealed in a wall 3 feet from where she walked every single day because she needed it contained, but she could not bring herself to let it go. She looked back down at the letter. She said very quietly, I knew too. I always knew someone was out there holding on to me. We stayed at the house until the sun went down. She took the letter with her when she left. She took one of the photographs, the one of her mother young and smiling in the sunlight, squinting against the brightness. She asked if she could come back sometime, and I told her this house was as much hers as it was mine, maybe more. I stood on the porch and watched her car move slowly back down Calloway Road and turn at the end of the street and disappear. The evening was cold and still, and the sky had gone that deep blue that comes just after sunset in early March, and I stood there on those repaired porch steps and looked at the street where my grandmother had waved every single morning for 30 years, and I felt something shift in the air around me. Not supernatural. Nothing like that. Just the particular stillness that arrives when something long unfinished finally reaches its end. I thought about walls, the ones we build in hallways and the ones we build in ourselves. The ones that are meant to contain grief and end up containing love instead, sealed up together in the dark, waiting for someone patient enough to knock and listen and recognize the hollow sound of something that was never meant to stay hidden forever. She had sealed it away so no one would be hurt by it. What she couldn't have known, what none of us can ever fully know when we're in the middle of our own quiet survivals, is that the very thing she hid for 40 years was the thing that would ultimately bring 2 strangers to a kitchen table in Ohio to sit together in the afternoon light, holding something fragile and true between them. The house had known all along. It had just been waiting for someone to finally listen to the walls. If this story stayed with you the way it has stayed with me, I'd love for you to subscribe before you go. I share stories like this one, real, quiet, human stories about family and the things we carry and the things we leave behind, and I'd love for you to be here for the next one. And if something in this story reminded you of someone in your own life, someone whose silence you never quite understood, someone who carried something you only found out about later, feel free to leave that in the comments. You don't have to share details. Sometimes just writing it down for a moment is enough. Take care of yourselves. I'll see you in the next one.